Look, I've been up since 5:22 Central Standard Time. Hello, everyone. All right, so I'm excited to be here. I apologize for the major delay of me getting here. I've been in several cities. I've had many rides, and I think the title of my talk is perfect because there was definitely some harm in some of the designs I was dealing with transportation, but I am here. And so I'm excited to come and talk to you, not necessarily about like a project I've worked on or anything of that nature, but honestly, a process that I've had to go through to really acknowledge and understand that if I'm actually going to be a strong practicing designer, I can't just focus on empathy. I have to focus on my humility, and I have to focus on equity. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey, examples that I've seen, and hopefully give you some tips that you all can take back with you and really reflect on how you can integrate more humility within your practice. Sounds good? All right, so for people that may not know me, I am the founder, president, and CEO of a nonprofit called Creative Reaction Lab. I also am the co-founder and co-director of Design Plus Diversity LLC, which has a conference and a national fellowship program. I was the founding chair of the Diverse Inclusion Task Force for AIGA, the Professional Association of Design. I was the one behind Design Census, Design for Inclusivity Summit, and on and on and on. In other words, I don't sleep. So today's perfect because I haven't slept. But within my journey and my practice, I really started to recognize that just showing up wasn't enough, especially if I didn't think about the potential of the harm and the trauma that I may be creating in any other work and practices that I was doing. And it also made me reflect on our own industry, because within the space, I hear a lot that designers are experts of empathy. And I've heard top execs say this, I've heard the freelance designers say this, I've seen media articles say this, which is fascinating to me because I don't remember taking a class in empathy or really seeing many designers receive this special treatment in empathy. And on my team, I have a social worker, and she kind of side-eyes like, oh, bless your little hearts, you know. But, you know, it makes me reflect on the fact that we love to talk about how we're empathetic because by nature, our practice touches everything, and we have to center people. But we also have to understand that we are humans. And if we haven't actually looked at our own biases, looked at our own privileges and how they're showing up in spaces, we can fall into the same traps of every other industry. And so I have started to really try to challenge that. And here's, actually a quote from a Design Observer talking about the role of empathy within the design business. We empathize with our clients, we empathize with our employees, we empathize with our customers. And I'm like, well, wonderful. We apparently have it figured out. But it also then made me reflect on what are we actually doing, and are they actually showing elements of empathy? And so usually what happens is that you have people from historically underinvested communities on a stage that tends to tell our industry that we are falling behind. We tend to be, whether it's around ability status, people of color, people of different gender identities, saying we need to be better. And these are examples of what we are seeing in some of our industry, more in the tech space. But when you have algorithms that are actually have a bias towards women in the tech space and then wonder why we don't have more women in the tech space, it's not because they're not there. There's plenty of them. But then we, of course, not even have a conversation around non-binary people and the fact that we are not even conscious of different pronouns when we are having discussions with one another because it makes us uncomfortable. Or the fact in our industry, we would love to build technology that is more fun and entertainment-centered, but tend to focus on the white man's body, if I'm going to be very frank, and not really others that are outside that realm. And I don't even want to talk about facial recognition software. I can't. I've gone to conferences where they have the wonderful facial recognition. I'm just like, so you don't see me? I'm right here. And it's showing up everywhere. It's showing up in traditional designs such as that. It's showing up in our public spaces when you have elements and materials such as this where it's created, where people cannot lay on and be comfortable, or people can't sit for an extended period of time. And you really start to question, who is that actually affecting really in our industry or in our community? Or you have where we are putting up actual spears and roadblocks in communities so that we are not allowing certain elements in the space, and it actually has had a reverse effect on our communities. Or, for an example, in St. Louis, our wonderful light rail system literally only travels one way, east and west. And even in that situation, it also is a situation where we sit and determine which stops are above ground and which ones are underground. And what's interesting about that is that that one line that our Metrolink runs also is a dividing line between whites and blacks within St. Louis, because we are still one of the most racially segregated cities in the country. We were number 5 a few years ago. And all of these things, it's funny when we look at them, some of them we're like, well, those aren't traditional design. That's not something that we would touch. But I think we need to actually challenge how we define design. Because in the 1960s, IBM defined design as the intention behind an outcome. They didn't call it a product, they didn't call it a building. They said it was the intention behind an outcome. Creative Reaction Lab had expanded upon that definition and said that it's the intention and unintentional impact behind an outcome. So in other words, everything actually has been by design. But that means we also need to understand how our designs also have exclusion and inequities within them. The National Equity Project that's actually located in Oakland talks about, come on Oakland, come through. Okay. Talks about how any system produces what it was designed to produce. And we sometimes hear this when we say, well, no, this is not our country. Our country would never do this. And it's like, have you actually thought about it, historical designs? I guarantee you it's actually showing up the way that it's supposed to. And actually there's an organization in Canada, it's the Center of Social Innovation, that talks about throughout our history, we have had many systems that have been by design. Some of them we regularly see every single day. And yet we also need to acknowledge that there are many people that have been left out of that system due to discrimination, unemployment, homelessness, poverty, etc. And how that actually is something that impacts the designs that we are doing. So we need to understand that just like all designs, whether it's traditional design, where we're talking about ads or we're talking about a product, we also need to understand that systems of oppression, inequality, and inequities are by design. But that also means that they can be redesigned. And so I'm one of those people that's trying to push people to become redesigners for justice. But we have to also understand that if we are going to design equitable and more inclusive outcomes, programs, traditional designs, we first have to build our own humility to actually become empathetic. So empathy is not just a word, but we love to see it in value statements. We love to see it in articles. It makes us feel good. But we need to understand that empathy is about action. And that just saying I'm empathetic is not the same of actually being empathetic. So empathy without humility many times shows up as judgment. Why is this way? Why are they this way? We need to shift certain things. It shows up in a way that many times we don't call it lack of empathy. We just think, no, this is just, they should have shifted something. Also, empathy without humility many times comes with justification of why something has happened. Well, it happened because of X, Y, and Z. And as opposed to actually analyzing the different systems and individual actions that led to potentially more trauma, we justify it. In St. Louis, the death and murder of Michael Brown Jr. was justified. But we have to look at the reality that we lost a life. And that is something that affects me not only as a resident of St. Louis, but I lost my 14-year-old brother to gun violence literally less than 2 years ago. And on some side, people could say it was justified, even though he was not in the community doing things he weren't supposed to do. He was actually in his room with his friends, and he was shot over an iPhone. But when this happened, I didn't just say that I lost my brother. In my mind, we also lost another young Black man because of the different systems that have led to what was actually happening. So I was trying to avoid the sense of potentially justification. Also, empathy without humility really is showing up where you need to understand that intention does not equal impact, and many times we want to pretend that it does. Well, I had the best intentions. I don't really care. And I know that sounds harsh, but I don't, because the impact of your decision is affecting me either way. Whether you felt there was a good reason or not, I need you to hear me. And I need us to shift this together, right? Also, empathy without humility many times means that we remove ourselves from the equation. I still love every time I open human-centered design efforts and they're like, oh, if you just fix a tire with someone, you will empathize with their experience. Oh. Okay. That's cute. And I find that funny because as someone that grew up in a historically undervested family, literally even now, my family was having a discussion on how my mother made $15,000 last year, and there was celebration because that's the most she's ever made. That was the environment I grew up in and I still have around me. And so if someone's fixing a tire besides me or her, we have a different experience because, especially in my family, I'm one of the only ones that actually have a car. And so if a tire is breaking down, there is an actual moment of trauma of, oh my goodness, will I be without a car again? Or if my car has broken down several times and I've been on the side of the road several times this last month, you coming to fix a tire besides me is not really gonna show the empathy and connection between us. We need to understand that it's not the same thing. And so we need to also acknowledge that if empathy doesn't have humility, then ultimately it's still about you. And we need to understand that humility is more than being humble about a situation. A colleague of mine in Missouri, she works at the Missouri History Museum, said that humility asks us to step outside of ourselves, listen, and absorb someone else's truth, even if it makes us feel defensive. It's a hard thing to do, and it is not something that once you've quote unquote accomplished it, you're like, okay, it's figured out. I am apparently now very humble, and I have humility. I think it's even more hilarious when people say, I am the example of humility. It's like, you know, that statement literally shows that you are not the example of humility. And so we need to understand that it is a lifelong journey of continually building your humility. So empathy with humility means that we acknowledge the role of self in the equation, in the situation, that we have discomfort and understand that discomfort many times equals to learning. If we're comfortable all the time, then you're not learning anything, and that is a problem. Also, we need to understand that it's admission, stating when you are wrong, stating when you've created harm, and also being conscious that you're trying to shift that. And don't do it just when, especially now because we have social media, we'll call someone out in a minute. There's a thing called Black Twitter. Twitter is amazing. I love it. But what tends to happen is many times someone or a company's called out in Black Twitter, and then all of a sudden they're like, but look at what we've done. We've been doing all these great things. And if you have to prove how you've been doing good things after I've called you out, then you actually maybe haven't really been doing what you're saying. And that we need to understand that vulnerability is part of the process throughout, and being transparent is part of the process throughout. Also, empathy plus humility means that we are learning together and understanding that we are both on that journey together. That I am not better than you and you are not better than me, that we are just in potentially different points of our own journey, but that is okay. Also, we're sharing power. How many times do we have discussions about actually sharing power? There's been situations where I've been asked to sit on panels to talk about cultural appropriation in Native communities. I'm not of Native or Indigenous descent, and that is another form of erasure. And so in those situations, I told them, no, you can give up my seat to someone that's actually from that community because I have no connection to it. You need to learn to share power. So if empathy has humility, then it's about us. And in Creative Reaction Lab's process, we pioneered a process called equity-centered community design. We do talk about this a lot in our framework, and it's actually one of our central pieces of our framework. And in it, we have people think about how do you examine your own identities, values, biases, assumptions, relationships to power, privilege. It's essentially putting a mirror up to yourself ongoing. And also thinking about what does it look like in real life? Discussing race publicly could be one way. Also noting personal assumptions. If I'm having quote unquote empathy interviews with someone in their living room, have I actually built trust with this individual, or am I walking in with an agenda already preset opposed to sharing power and we are co-creating that agenda together? We need to be very conscious of that. Also, with building our empathy, we need to ask questions such as what assumptions and biases do I have about the people and communities impacted by this project? I like to ask the question, what are the unintended consequences of what I'm doing? And not after it happens, but while we're planning. Also, what assumptions have we built into our metrics of success? And many times, who's actually defining the metrics of success? Is it you or the people, again, impacted by whatever you are co-creating, hopefully, with them? But you have to understand that it starts with you. And I didn't want to just say, here's some of the things you need to do. I also will shine a light on myself because my journey started with me. And here's an example of one way in which I did not show humility or, honestly, really empathy. This was a few years ago. I went to a conference. They had one of the old style photo cameras. And, they took a photo, and everyone, honestly, that were lighter skinned than me, you saw them very clearly. This is with a flash. This is with a close-up. It was very hard to see. Jessica's laughing. It was very hard to see me. And when I posted this on social media, I was primarily talking about the fact that back in the day, photography, and even now, did not really take into account darker skins and how that form of erasure creates harm and more trauma. However, I also, in the time, made a statement saying, apparently I really need to stay out of the sun. Pay attention to that statement, okay? So a colleague of mine called me out. And she was like, I can imagine someone darkening you taking this photo, say someone like myself, I'm darkening you, and I don't have a problem with your coloring in this photo. Because her big post, if you look at it originally at the bottom, was, please stay in the sun, nothing wrong with being darker, just use sunscreen. And my initial reaction, as you see here, was, you're not getting what I'm saying. I am not talking about being in the sun or being darker skinned. I am not talking about colorism, which also shows up in our society. I'm just saying that this is a problem. And I'm gonna just be honest, she definitely read me. And I deserve that read. She read me on this because she says, suggesting being darker skinned as a Black person is a bad thing, even as a joke. It is an unconscious way of internalizing and normalizing anti-Blackness. I take issue with that. Instead, you made this exchange about photography lighting, which is a different topic. It doesn't end there. So this is when, excuse my French, I fucked up. This is when I wrote, what? If you would have saw my Instagram story that accompanied this, then you would have seen my statement was about the type of photography and how historically people of color were not considered, even in little things like photography. I'm definitely not normalizing anti-Blackness, as my work is about nothing but appreciating our cultural history and addressing racism and racial inequities, including colorism. However, if you found my statement offensive, then I apologize. Very, very bad. It's funny because I talk about this experience and how it made me learn that how I needed more humility in my own practice, but I hadn't actually read my statements until I created this presentation. And when I read that last statement, I was like, oh, girl. Like, because this is an example of, but I'm the expert. I know what I'm doing. I can't make mistakes. Or if I equate it to some of the things we hear in our community, but I have several non-binary or Black friends. How dare you? And I myself, even though I work in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging space, also did this and created harm. And so we need to understand that building empathy is a messy and complex journey. That was a few years ago for me. I know I still make mistakes. And one of the things I'm conscious of is trying to acknowledge it and continue to improve. And so I want to leave you with some last minute tips because I'm over time, but I think they're going to forgive me because I've been on the plane way longer than on the stage. So, last tips I want to give you. When trying to actually design no harm, understand your power and responsibility to design perspectives and outcomes. I remember there was a book I was reading, it was around social impact design, especially earlier in my career, and I was like, yes, give it to me, case studies, love it, wonderful. Last page, it said, design cannot change the world, and I threw the book across the room. I was like, how dare you? But again, I think it comes back to how we define design and also acknowledge the power that we have within our industry. We are narrative and livelihood shapers. We impact how people perceive themselves. We impact that life expectancy and quality of life people also have every single day. That is extremely powerful. That is not something that should be just looked away from and said, but I just created it on my computer. Also, we need to appreciate and amplify living expertise equally, if not more, than professional expertise. I honestly do not care how many letters you have behind your name. I don't care if you have a BFA, an MFA, I don't care, a PhD. I care more about that, I know this sounds bad, but I do care more about the person that's in the community living the situation day by day, every single day, and still surviving and still moving forward. Their perspective needs to be at the table, and let me also state, they should also be paid for their time, just like you're getting paid for yours. Okay? Also, don't design in ivory towers, but live and immerse yourself on the ground. And understand that your computer, your pencil, your Wacom tablet is an ivory tower. I practiced graphic design. I studied graphic design. That was one of my 5 majors that was mentioned. And I honestly don't do this much anymore. I now view my work as more around system design and really trying to shift in that way. Question your proximity to power. Understand should you step in or center others, and I don't like the term step in. We actually as a team don't like it. We call it ableist language. We're trying to figure out a better way to say that. But understand when should you be the one centered or when should you be the one leveraging your power and access on behalf of someone with their living expertise. Value the act of building trust and removing agendas, which I stated earlier. When people from historically underinvested communities speak, listen first before questioning. Sometimes I even ask you, don't question, just listen and really absorb it and reflect on it. Because too many times people, especially living experts, their opinions are devalued or erased. And sometimes we need to understand that our questions may actually create more trauma and harm. I personally made a decision a long time ago that I will be okay with educating people if they ask me questions about my experiences. However, not everyone has made that agreement, and that is completely fine. They have that choice. If they don't want to answer your question, there is a beautiful thing called Google. Figure it out, okay? Also, acknowledge that you're on a journey and learning while doing, and equally so is everyone else. Normalize statements of I don't know. And adding to that, understand that perfectionism is a form of white supremacy. This idea of being perfect does not exist, and we need to let that go. And then you need to start and follow through. I'm going to end on a quote from a colleague of mine in Cincinnati. She said, design is not about making things look good, but making things work. So we need to make sure that when we're making things work, we need to think about who it's working for, and honestly, also who it potentially could be harming at the same time. So thank you so much, and I wish you all the rest of the day.